I want to welcome everyone to the latest I4CP next Thursday. Welcome everyone. Great to see so many familiar names and faces who join us, if not every week, most weeks. Also some new folks joining us. I really liked seeing the nice spread of locations that everyone's joining from today, including Mary Tomlinson, who said, "I'm joining from my dining room in Seattle." I love the specificity there. We've spent a lot of time on these calls talking about flexible and hybrid work over the past year and a half. And so that definitely speaks to that for sure. So again, welcome everyone. We've got a special call today. We have new research on culture fitness, and I'll be introducing our two guests that'll be leading us through the conversation on that in just a minute. But I do have a few announcements to always make at the outset. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are I4CP, the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm that discovers the people practices that drive high performance in organizations. When we say high performance, we're looking at four typical criteria: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction over a 5-year period. And what that allows us to do in our quantitative surveys is to tease out what the high-performing organizations do more often than low performers. We are a member-driven organization, and you can see here just a small sample of our member organizations that have full access to all of our research. We, of course, make available to the broader public some snippets of our research, executive briefs, infographics, and some community calls like the one you're joining here today. But we want to give a special welcome to all of our member organizations. You see the nice broad range of companies, large, medium-sized, even some smaller ones as well, really spanning across all industries. If you're not a member and are interested to learn more, you can contact any of the I4CP folks that are on this call, or just go out to our website, and it's easy enough to do there. One other thing that I wanted to note, because it's fast approaching, is our Next Practices Now conference, which is held this year at the end of March. We had to take a couple of years off from joining in person during the COVID pandemic, of course, but last March we were delighted to get back together again at the Fairmont Princess in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're doing the same as we've generally done every year. We're already setting records for attendance. It's a great conference for HR leaders. You see here some of the speaker lineup that we've got. This is not all the speakers, but it's a nice representative sample. We've got book authors, thought leaders, CHROs, and other top leaders that you'll want to hear from. Always look forward to this conference. To learn more, if you haven't registered yet, just go to i4cp.com/conference. And then my last note is the agenda today, which I'll be introducing our two guests in just a moment to walk through that new culture fitness research. Do want to note again that we have these calls, this Next Practices Weekly series, every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. You see here some of the great organizations that will be represented as guests coming up. We've got folks from Experian, Providence Health, and Toro. So you'll want to get registered and be able to attend as many of those as possible. One nice thing too is that we record these sessions, so if in a given week you can't make it, you can always watch the recording later. But with that, no more announcements because we've got a jam-packed session today. I want to introduce our CEO and co-founder, Kevin Oakes, and also my colleague, Catherine Brecken, Senior Research Analyst here at I4CP, and they're going to lead us through this discussion on culture fitness. So I'll hand it off to Kevin first.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. Appreciate that nice intro. And hopefully you'll be monitoring some of the questions in the chat from folks, and feel free to chime in at any time. I'm very happy to welcome Catherine Brecken. Catherine and I have been doing a lot of these presentations together. Catherine, good to see you this morning. I hear you were out in 0-degree weather this morning.
Nice to see you this morning as well, and everyone else on the call. It's great to be here. And yeah, it was 0 degrees, balmy, downright balmy for a little jog this morning. Had to get ready for the call, wake up, you know.
Catherine is in upstate Minnesota, so kudos to you for getting out in that weather. Well, also kudos to you, Catherine, for creating such a really interesting study here called Culture Fitness, the Healthy Habits of High Performance Organizations. Catherine was the lead analyst on this study, and it's the latest in our work around culture overall. We've been fascinated by the subject of organizational culture and how much of an impact it really has on the financial performance of organizations and so many other aspects of companies. And it really builds on the work that we did with Culture Renovation, which we turned into a book, and we'll talk about towards the end, on how do you change organizational culture. But one of the key findings, I thought, Catherine, from this study really revolved around the connection to financial performance of the organizational culture. I love this stat because if there's anybody in your organization who poo-poos the importance of culture, you really just need to show them this, that high-performance organizations are nearly 6 times more likely to have a healthy culture, what we call a fit culture, compared to low-performance organizations. And this also had an impact on productivity overall, Catherine, something that you researched and through regression analysis found some interesting correlations.
Absolutely. And so back up just a little bit too to provide perspective. Our report here is based on a major survey and dozens of interviews that we've done with HR leaders over the past year. We had a survey that was fielded in September and October, and about 1,000 respondents representing 53 countries. Roughly half of those were large organizations with over 1,000 employees. And right, so that right out of the gate, key finding was, this connection between market performance and a healthy culture. But we wanted to dig a little deeper and find out why. What's the relationship, what's going on, what's impacting what. And so we did a regression analysis, and our statistical model found a very strong correlation between healthy cultures and employee productivity, increased employee productivity specifically. And that employee productivity therefore had a strong connection to market performance. So it's sort of the missing link, if you will, in that relationship. And really, it speaks again to helping get culture out of that sort of squishy verbiage, and really making, it part of a quantitative strategy that you can do to increase market performance.
An important aspect of this study too, Catherine, was that we were really looking at culture since the beginning of the pandemic and what has happened really over the last couple of years to organizational culture. And I think in this case around productivity, it's a very interesting finding. Certainly recently, there's been a lot written about the BLS statistics that have shown overall in America anyway, productivity, non-farm productivity, I should clarify, has decreased. And so there's been a lot of speculation that is because of remote work and flexible work. And as a result, a number of CEOs have asked employees, in some cases forced employees back into the office in an effort to improve productivity. Most of what we found in this study is that probably has almost no effect on productivity, maybe even a negative effect. What really affects productivity is the health of the overall culture. And we'll get into some of the particulars of that. But I wish these same CEOs would spend the effort that they've expended to get people back into the office on how do we improve the culture of the organization.
Mm-hmm. On that note, Kevin, there was a fascinating article in Fortune this morning that looked at productivity using those BLS numbers and tracking when employees were going back to the office. And they were able to correlate the times when leaders were pulling employees back into the office with reduced productivity. And the culture, they're saying the culture that's created when employees demanded, when leaders demanded, employees come back to the office, the culture suffered. And perhaps that is what, resulted in that reduced productivity. So go right to our research, really.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I saw that same article, and it is a fascinating one. We'll have to work that talk track in more formally to our presentations here.
Yeah.
But I thought that was interesting. And, we do follow a lot of articles, a lot of headlines, and here's just a snapshot of some of the headlines that we've been following around culture and what companies are really worried about as we've emerged from the pandemic, as we've moved to new work models. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of articles just around what has happened to our culture. And what we've been advising companies to do is, instead of being passive or reactive to what the pandemic has done to your culture, the smart companies are being very proactive. They're taking actions to make sure that they're developing the culture that they want for the future. And I think a lot of the lessons that we've come out with in the research really help those organizations take the right steps towards creating a healthy culture. But unfortunately, we've seen a number of cultures suffer during the pandemic. And Catherine, I'll let you walk through a few of these slides just around what has happened to culture in some companies during the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, as you can see here, our survey found that more than a third of organizations reported that their culture actually became more toxic over the past 2 years. And if you go to the next slide, you can kind of see why. Let's see. That's because if there's ever a reason to highlight the importance of culture, it's these. Organizations with toxic cultures were more likely to suffer statistically from these bulleted items here that Kevin is laying out. Disrespectful behavior, senior leaders who don't trust employees, employees who don't trust senior leaders. This is key. This had a negative correlation to market performance, workforce outcomes, and culture health. Some of the strongest correlations in the study, in fact. 57% of organizations with poor market performance, by the way, said this is a problem, employees not trusting senior leaders. Leaders favoring on-site versus remote employees. We've heard a lot about proximity bias and how toxic that can be in the news, I feel like lately, and our research here at I4CP certainly backs that up. Unsafe environments for expressing opinions and concerns. That's a very big hit to any culture that's trying to emphasize safety. Bullying. This had a very strong correlation to poor culture health and workforce outcomes. Pay inequity, lack of recognition, and lack of inclusiveness. Those last two had strong negative correlations to workforce outcomes and culture health, by the way.
And from this, we found several traits of toxic cultures, which you coined the toxic 9, Catherine. So I'll let you also explain this one.
Well, I mean, it turns out organizations that indicated their culture was toxic or unfit, as we've been describing it in the report, were describing their organizations with common traits. These are the traits that they sort of correlated specifically to those with the poorest health in their culture. And they had, let's see, I think it was 26 options to choose from, 26 different traits that participants in the survey could pick, only 5 of to describe their culture. So they had to pick their top 5 out of 26, which included an other category, right, with an open response option. And these were the 9 that rose to the top of our analysis. In any one of these, in our regression analysis, when we controlled for market performance and the size of the organization, accounted for 15 to 22% of how participants rated their culture health. So these are essentially drivers of negative culture. And they tend to feed off of each other, and there's a steamrolling effect that would make it worse.
Yeah, and I think from a indicator perspective, one of the things that you've been advising companies, Catherine, is this is almost a canary in the coal mine situation. If you're seeing some of these traits in your culture, it's an indicator that you've probably got other issues as well. I'm struck by just how frequent these were mentioned versus companies that said they had healthy cultures. It's really startling how often people would mention these in toxic cultures or unfit cultures.
Absolutely. These are excellent cues. So in any listening strategy, if these are the ways that your employees are commonly describing your organizational culture, that's a really good indication you've got at least a pocket of toxicity within the organization.
I'll just jump in and note that this is a very interesting list as well. As you said, Catherine, these were the ones from a much broader set that rose to the top. Some of these are clearly, toxic, disrespectful, insensitive, but a few of these or I would have thought going in were maybe only mildly toxic, like conflict avoidant or even hierarchical. I mean, the military is hierarchical. Lots of organizations have gotten by with some degree of hierarchy over the years, and maybe some degree of hierarchy is even necessary. But the fact that even those are on this list and have that powerful correlation that you see there on the right, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think, Tom, as you look at this list, things like hierarchical and bureaucratic certainly go together. And what it equates to is a slow-moving organization, one that is not as agile, right, in times where we have had to be extremely agile and adapt to changes out in the environment. And that's another thing that we found in the study is that companies that were averse to change, where the employee base really despised change, wanted it to be, wanted everything to be the same, and when change happened, found it to be exhausting, wearing them down. Those typically were organizations that had unfit cultures. The cultures where the employee base said, you know what, change is not only normal, but we see it as an opportunity. It's expected out in the environment, and we're gonna take advantage of it. Those tended to be the healthier cultures. So I think there's an interesting theme around that, Tom, where you look at something like a hierarchical and think, okay, that's not unusual, but it really does equate to that agility factor, in my opinion. Now, there were a couple other stats that I thought were pretty interesting, and we wanted to call these out. We referenced this briefly, but those who describe their organizations as toxic cultures, they were 16 times more likely to say that there was a lack of trust in senior leaders. And trust is something we'll hear a lot more about, in my opinion, over the next couple of years. We're definitely seeing a trust factor between employees and leaders. A lot of that boils down to behaviors of leaders, and are we training those leaders on the behaviors we expect, and are they in line with the values of the organization? Some of it boils down to collaboration and communication, and how often and frequently are those senior leaders communicating. There's a number of other issues that go into it, but I think that lack of trust is a big issue. And then also the bottom one, that those toxic environments were 10 times more likely to say we don't have psychological safety here. We don't feel like we can express our opinions or concerns. It goes back to the trust factor, but we've been talking about psychological safety for a long time, and it continues to bubble up as a real separator between healthy environments and unhealthy environments.
Absolutely.
This is another one, Catherine, that we found to be pretty interesting, and I'll let you talk to this.
Sure. So when examining which behaviors happen in organizations with any of those 9 toxic traits, our study found that leadership actions, particularly inaction or unwanted behavior, emerged as a main catalyst. So you can see here, leaders in organizations with toxic cultures were 4 to 5 times more likely to be described as disregarding poor behavior when making decisions about talent, such as advancement and compensation, succession planning, performance ratings, award and recognition, and high potential employee designations. Conversely, those with organizations that had fit cultures were 6 times more likely to report that behavioral issues are addressed as soon as they are identified. And I like to tie this back to the other slide too, on the psychological safety, that we just discussed, and trust. I think there's a point about consistency. Dealing with poor behavior consistently and right away. And when leaders demonstrate, values consistently, you'll see that as another item that's really important in driving health culture. Employees know what to expect, and therefore they can trust more in their leadership. So I think that there's a consistency aspect, and then when organizations vary a lot in how they respond to talent decisions, there's a lack of trust that develops quickly.
Yeah. I think sometimes the problem is in the definition of poor behavior. What somebody might view as poor behavior, somebody else might not. And I think that's where you get into some gray areas inside of organizations. But when it's obvious poor behavior, it's something that absolutely has to be addressed to keep a culture healthy. And it's the age-old conundrum, does the end justify the means? And in healthy cultures, they recognize that the means are just as important as the results. They are not overlooking those brilliant jerks inside the organization, or as Bob Sutton put it, in his no asshole rule book, those people that are very competent and ultimately get the job done, but just leave a path of destruction in their wake. That can be so detrimental long-term to the organization. And I think we find time and time again, healthy cultures address that, and they make sure that the behaviors match up to the results themselves.
Absolutely. We have an interesting question from John Aubrey. Would you agree that lack of trust in senior leaders also makes change harder to implement effectively?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Catherine. You answer that one.
No, I agree it would, but I also don't think a culture reset or culture renovation is impossible if people don't trust their senior leaders. I think a culture renovation, following some of the 18 steps that you identify in your book, Kevin, that initial research on culture that we started a year or so ago, there's a restart that can happen, and trust can be built when it's done collaboratively.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I'm looking at this question from Cecilia, and thanks, Tom, for pointing this out, that sometimes it's not very obvious that you have a toxic culture. So, you can use the term blindside here, but, one of the things that we've been suggesting to companies for some time now, Cecilia, is that if an executive team locks themselves in a conference room and decides amongst themselves what's right and what's wrong about the culture, they inevitably are going to get it wrong. And that's because things are filtered by the time they get to the executive team. They don't necessarily know the true issues that are bubbling under the surface inside the organization. And that's what blindsided companies like Wells Fargo with their sales issues, or Boeing and the 737 MAX tragedies. We could go on and on. There are a number of companies that, have had some cultural issues that ultimately just kind of blew up on them. And had they employed a listening strategy throughout the workforce and really understood employee sentiment and created an environment that was psychologically safe to share that sentiment, they would have understood some of those cultural issues. And so listening is something that we think is just core to making sure you have a healthy culture, and is something we called out in the report itself.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on that?
No, we're going to talk about making sure you're measuring continually as well, and I think that will help. But I also just posted for members on the call, we have an excellent employee listening series. There was a white paper that was recently produced. It's fantastic. Great resources there.
Now, the good news is that not all cultures suffered during the pandemic. We found more companies said that their culture actually became healthier during the pandemic. And that's great, because I think a number of these companies developed healthy habits that have carried them forward, and they're continuing to build some of those habits that they developed during the pandemic. We saw a lot more expression of empathy by senior management in a lot of organizations. We saw really sort of an appreciation for the full persona, as opposed to just the work persona or office persona of individuals. And I think a lot of people looked at their peers a little differently during the pandemic, and that's carried forward post-pandemic. So we found that healthy cultures excelled in certain core outcomes. And there's going to be a lot of stats on this particular slide, so we'll walk through them. The first one is around employee net promoter scores, or ENPS. And Catherine, this is one that you just love as a finding of this study.
I do. And it's sort of a chicken or the egg, right? But the fit cultures, those with the healthiest cultures, were 9 times more likely to report an excellent ENPS score between 71 and 100 compared to unfit or toxic counterparts. And when employees want to recommend their organization to their friends, their family, that's a really good sign that you have a good culture.
And I think this is a key stat to look at over time. What are the trends in your ENPS score? Are you trending up? Are you trending down? This will be a good indicator, certainly as an early warning sign if you have some issues in your culture. Well, we also found since the onset of the pandemic, there were a number of other things that these healthy cultures had in common. They were 4.5 times more likely to report an increase in their employee engagement scores overall. They're also 4 times more likely to have experienced improved retention of existing employees. That, to me, was a very eye-catching finding from this study, and one that I know a lot of companies will find interesting, just as they're trying to make sure that they retain their employees. Even though we've had some headlines around layoffs, unemployment remains at historic lows, and retention is an issue for a lot of organizations, particularly of their hypos and their high performers. Another stat that I think will attract a lot of attention is that healthy cultures were 3 times more likely to report that they had a better ability to attract top talent to their company. Again, that we're still seeing a lot of organizations struggle to find the right talent for the future of their organization. So I thought that was a really cool finding. We talked about increased productivity. They were 2 times more likely to report that they had increased employee productivity in the workforce, and nearly 3 times more likely to report improved well-being. I think those 2 things go hand in hand with each other, and certainly is a outcome of having a healthy culture. And the last one was around diversity. We found that nearly 1.5 times more likely were companies to report that they improve their diversity and representation if they had a healthy culture. So great stats, and kudos, Catherine, for unearthing these as part of the analysis of all the data that we had.
I like to think of them as wonderful symptoms of a healthy culture.
And here are some wonderful traits. So I'll let you walk through some of these.
Sure. So just as toxic organizations, participants from toxic organizations tended to talk about their organization and describe it in common ways, those from our healthiest organizations also had common traits that bubbled up as they used to describe their organization. And again, this is from that extensive list, 26 options that they could have chosen, including another. And those are the very healthiest cultures tended to use these 6. They had the strongest correlation. And interestingly, so in our report, and we've talked about it so far already, but we talk about fit versus unfit cultures. Well, we started the survey out with a Likert scale, right? Asking people to rate their culture currently and range from very healthy to very toxic. And then we corroborated that with these 6 traits, which show the strongest correlation to healthy. So we've got a very strong definition of what is fit. And which cultures are doing this well, and that we can watch, and we know now some of the strategies and practices that they're doing to improve their culture, and we'll get to those shortly.
I could jump in here real quick. We've got a question from the chat from Mara. With all of this compelling data that's correlating performance, productivity, retention, attraction, she asks, why do you think there's so much resistance to changing many leaders, their leadership style? Is it a lack of awareness on their part, or resistance to change? What do we think it is?
Well, I think the key word in that question was data. I think those leaders are ignoring data or not utilizing data and taking an evidence-based approach to how they're leading in the organization. And we see it time and time again, just because they've been in the news a ton. Twitter is a good example, where clearly Elon Musk is using gut instinct and his own, personal preferences to managing a number of aspects of the culture. And so, initially it was everybody back in the office. Just recently, he's now embraced some aspects of remote work, mainly around the shutting of the Seattle office and a couple other offices, and not firing everybody that was in those offices and letting them work remotely. But it's sort of knee-jerk reaction and not really using employee sentiment or what employees want, or some of the data like that we're presenting here to make those decisions. And so I think that's one of the biggest reasons. I'd love to hear, Catherine or Tom, what you think.
I agree. I mean, I think culture has been looked at as some sort of squishy, nebulous, hard to define thing that people just think happens to your organization organically through the people you bring in. It's a culture by demographic design, I guess. But I think as we'll show in the next slide, there is a way to control your fate, control the fate of the organization's culture. And we have evidence-based strategies that can move the needle on culture health. But again, seeing that data, I think, is very important for leaders to see that connection between market performance and culture. And
yeah, I guess I'll just add on that question, that point, not to make excuses for these leaders, but yes, if they haven't seen this kind of powerful data that you two are sharing today, they need to, because they've gotten to where they are as leaders, leading in certain ways. So until they're confronted with alternatives, with other data, other strategies, they're going to continue to lead in the ways that they've led. This has come up when we've talked about hybrid and remote work. A lot of these folks were always in the office, and they've risen up in the ranks in multiple companies. Often they're on boards and everything by being in the office all these years. And so that's what they know. It worked for them. So why can't it work for everyone else? So I think there may be a little bit of that sort of holdover mentality.
And so, Catherine, what I've built out here are the 7 habits that you found of very healthy cultures. Do you want to walk through those?
Sure. So you can read the 7 here, and we are going to go through flexibility and a learning mindset and those 4 items that leaders are responsible for in the next few slides. So what I really wanted to focus on here was number 3, boards that care about culture. So organizations that indicated their board cares about or thinks about culture as important to a high extent. Those had a very strong correlation to the health of their culture, obviously. So if the board cares about it, they're driving, practices and theory. They're bringing sunlight to the culture data. They're going to help make and influence that culture, right? That makes sense. But this is also another reason for, I think, leaders to take note, and especially for boards to take note and start to think seriously about culture and leadership change. Recent legal decisions, and then there's the forthcoming human capital disclosure regulations from the SEC. The EU's already implemented their own extensive reporting on human capital is coming, if not here already. And so organizations, especially boards, are going to really have to start looking at culture and caring. And of course, there was that Delaware court decision recently that ruled in the case of McDonald's, former CHRO, that shareholders can sue officers for failing to build a healthy culture. And so if we could, I'll post an article in the chat on that as well. So it's just another reason that boards should care about culture, because obviously that's not in your control per se, but it's another reason to bubble to the surface why culture needs to be front and center in the board.
Well, and I think HR needs to be prepared for the data that boards are going to be demanding around culture, particularly as they set up separate culture subcommittees as part of the governance process in those boards. And we've certainly talked a lot about that in the past.
Absolutely.
Here are some traits of fit cultures, much like we showed some traits of unfit cultures and the frequency that they were mentioned versus those unfit cultures. So we've covered several of these already, but I thought this was a very interesting list, and we use this really almost as the definition of a healthy culture overall. They certainly have a lot in common as you scan down that list. But building on the idea of traits of healthy cultures, this is a chart that came out of our work on culture renovation and was in the book Culture Renovation, looking at different common culture types. There are a lot more types than just what's listed here, but these are the ones that are more commonly mentioned by organizations, certainly from our research. And then leadership traits and employee traits that usually equate to that culture type. And then we gave some examples of companies that you would think of as part of the culture types. This is now a new favorite chart of mine that we've brought out because of Twitter on here. When we put this chart together, Twitter was often thought of as a collaborative company, and you can see the leadership traits were facilitator and transparent. Employee traits were open-minded and team-oriented. I think that we'd have some different descriptors now if we surveyed folks around what they felt about the traits inside the company. So that's how quickly things can change around a culture, certainly based on leaders, and leaders have a huge impact on what the culture is. So think about what culture type is your organization overall. And I don't know, were we going to do a poll on this one, Catherine, or we just decide to skip that? I can't remember.
I believe so. Zeta, do we have there we are.
Okay. So if you could take a second, and you can pick more than one here, and most cultures are more than one, although we found that very few cultures have all of these traits that they would say are indicative of their company. But tell us what culture types you have in your organization, and we'll see how that maps to some of our previous data.
Oh, interesting. I was doing the breakdown by industry of our data, and it turned out, so purpose and mission is the top trait for those in the healthcare industry. No surprise, but this is what you would expect, right? It's what you want.
Sure.
Yeah, it's customer focused in business services. That was their number one. And purpose and mission also for education in the education industry.
Catherine's been doing some interesting breakdowns, not only by industry, but also by geography. And we found definitely some differences between North America, particularly US and Canada. And then as you compare that region to Europe or to Asia, and how they are describing their organizations, we found particularly some interesting differences in Europe versus the rest of the world. And she'll be publishing an article on that shortly.
Yeah, I guess a teaser is the companies headquartered in Canada have the healthiest cultures of all the other regions.
So our Canadian friends will love that.
Yes,
All right. Are we ready to stop the poll here?
I think so.
So it looks like there's a lot of similarity to what we had on the slide here. Customer focus was a popular answer, the number one most popular answer. But things like, let's see, purpose and mission, as you just called out, Catherine, was also a top answer, along with collaborative and performance. The one that wasn't necessarily as popular here, agile, I think is going to become much more popular going forward. As I said earlier, I think a lot of CEOs, a lot of senior teams want to instill more agility inside their organization. When I talk to senior leaders, that's one that gets brought up quite a bit. They're also looking to have a more inclusive culture and more innovative culture. Those are things that I often hear senior leaders say, I want more of going forward. All right, so why don't we move on here and let's talk a little bit about flexibility. And Catherine, again, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Get me caught up with my notes here. So we asked organizations to tell us about their work model before the pandemic and today, and we categorized it as mostly on-site, mostly hybrid, mostly remote. I know that's kind of vague, but it'll give you the sort of the gist of how their work model is structured. And we found that those organizations that were mostly remote had a very high correlation to healthy culture. And their cultures had improved over the past 2 years. They've gotten healthier, but also a very strong correlation to improved employee well-being over the past 2 years. And that makes a lot of sense, as we've heard from various places that those who have been working remote have a lot more work-life flexibility. But I think that key really is flexibility. And when you look at companies that are doing hybrid, right? The majority of our survey participants were in this hybrid model of some kind, and they filled out sort of if you're looking at the data in a bell curve, they're most of that bell. But there was no statistical correlation between being hybrid and any employee outcomes. And I think that's because there's a lot of variation in what we call hybrid, and a lot of the hybrid models are not as flexible as employees would like. They're getting sort of pulled back into the office out of their, not out of their own will, and they're on Zoom meetings in the office and so forth instead of actually collaborating. So I think there's lots more to do with that hybrid model that we have in improving that.
Yeah, I mean, in many organizations, hybrid is a forced model on employees. And so I think a lot of this boils down to autonomy. How much autonomy are you giving employees to have work-life blend as opposed to just balance? Having the ability to control when you do work, when you're not doing work, where you're doing that work. Whereas some hybrid models are saying you must be in the office, these days of the week at these times, and it doesn't give that autonomy. So I think you're spot on, Catherine, with that observation.
Yeah. One last thing I'll note on this is that those organizations that indicated they're mostly on-site today had a negative correlation to employee productivity. So kind of, on that note, how is work arrangement really affecting productivity? How is work arrangement affecting culture? I think there's going to be some interesting connections there.
We also found interesting connections around the topic of learning. And this builds on other research that we've done in the past that showed similar connections, that cultures of learning generally are not only healthy cultures, but they're also high-performing organizations. And I just love this, and I know a lot of my learning friends on the line love this finding, that when we share knowledge as a workforce, generally we're going to be a more inclusive organization. We're going to be a more agile organization because we is smarter than me. And so we're really leveraging the collective wisdom of the entire workforce. And we're combating that age-old problem of knowledge is power. A lot of organizations that have toxic cultures, they let that fester. They let people selectively use their knowledge to protect themselves, protect their fiefdoms, as opposed to recognizing and rewarding people who are sharing knowledge on a regular basis. I love some of the other bullet points here, just around having senior leaders and mid-level and frontline leaders all trained on the desired behaviors. We're going to have a wonderful presentation at our conference by Anna White, who's the CHRO at F5, and they've done a great job at training their leaders on the behaviors that they expect inside their organization. The third one is a favorite of mine around internal mobility. We've got an HBR article out there and webinar and a lot of research on that topic alone. We're seeing more and more attention to mobility these days as companies recognize it's a great way to not only retain employees, but to develop employees inside the organization. The more we get them moving around inside the organization, it improves the collaboration and communication of the company as well. And improves overall the culture health. So internal mobility is a strategy not formalized in many companies, but the companies that have formalized it, they tend to be off the charts high-performing organizations. So if you haven't looked at how do you formalize a mobility program inside your organization, take a look at some of the research that we've already done on that topic and see what you can do to increase that. And it really kind of feeds into this last bullet point, a favorite topic of Tom's, around how do you build an internal talent marketplace. A lot of that boils down to creating a skills database initially, and just really understanding the skills that you have amongst the workforce. And then how are you staffing projects and initiatives based on those skills, as opposed to based on where somebody is in the org chart or where they physically reside. That internal talent marketplace, again, is not something that has been formalized in a majority of organizations, but more and more companies are putting that in place. And the ones that do tend to have very healthy cultures and tend to be high-performing organizations. But Tom or Catherine, anything else you'd want to add to that?
I'll just jump in since, yes, I've done a lot of work on skills databases, talent mobility, internal talent marketplaces, and I was just presenting on that topic to the Training 2023 conference in Orlando just earlier this week. And there were, even though it was an L&D conference, there were a lot of leaders at that event that were very interested, and some of them already sort of knee deep in that journey and wanting to hear best practices on how to move forward.
Great. And Tom, I'm now looking at the chat. So if there's any questions there that you want to throw out to us, please do. A couple other things that we want to mention. One is that leaders are clearly the linchpin of healthy cultures. Those healthy cultures generally have leaders who are leading by example. They are being held accountable for employee outcomes, such as development and promotions of employees. They're being held accountable on things like diversity, and other metrics that really focus on the employees themselves as opposed to just the business outcomes. They are regularly communicating values and, as we talked about earlier, addressing that poor behavior immediately and not letting it fester.
Interestingly, too, leaders consistently demonstrating organizational values. That had the largest influence on culture compared to sort of all the other variables in the study. It accounted for 42% of how leaders assessed their organization's culture fitness. So that's a really big deal. And it goes back to, again, leader behaviors and consistency.
Excellent. Now, Catherine mentioned earlier that healthy cultures are doing a very good job at measuring and monitoring what's happening from the culture perspective. And so as part of this study, we took a look at a couple of aspects of that. One was the methods that companies are using to measure. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that healthier cultures are doing. They're doing specific culture audits. They're doing stay interviews, particularly with their high performers and high potentials inside the organization. They're listening to customers. They're listening to employees, much like we talked about earlier, from an employee sentiment perspective. And when it comes to the specific measures that they're looking at, these are some of the measures that those healthy cultures pay attention to. And I think it's important that whenever you're looking at measures, you're looking at multiple measures. You're not just relying on one or two, like employee engagement, which is one that a lot of companies have been relying on to measure your culture. Oftentimes those surveys are a point in time and you can get false positives. And so you want to have multiple measures and measure frequently so that you can see what's trending over time. And that's really the key word, is trending in culture. Anything else you want to add on this one, Catherine?
Well, sort of on the last two slides, one thing that you've talked a lot about and is in your book is, using, continually listening, right? And using natural language processing to understand those sort of the greater sentiments. So you can use Likert scales and all, in your surveys, but you're going to get more from employees. You're going to understand more if you have open response questions, if you have interviews, that sort of like the qualitative stuff. So having the technology to analyze those and surface trends and themes within those comments is going to be really helpful. And you could use the Toxic 9, you could use the 6 characteristics of very healthy cultures if you're seeing those trends bubble up, or those traits bubble up, excuse me, you'll know you've got healthy and where you've got sort of toxic pockets.
And that listening extends beyond just inside the organization. We often have used natural language processing tools to scrape Glassdoor and other external sites to see from an employer brand perspective what people are saying about the culture externally. Sometimes that can be disgruntled employees for sure, but it's what your candidates are reading. And I think it's important data for any organization to consider when you're looking at the overall culture. You'll get sometimes a little bit more truth externally than you do get internally. And so it's important to factor that into the whole equation. So, Catherine, you had this chart in the study, which is a nice sort of ending chart around some of the interventions that positively influence culture.
So what you're seeing here are 9 actions your organization can take that our regression analysis has found to impact or influence culture fitness. So as you can see here, leaders' consistent demonstration of organizational values reigns supreme in its ability to move the needle on culture, and explaining 43% of how participants rated culture health. And the above percentages, these are based on R-squared values. If you're familiar with multiple regression, that's what we're looking at. But again, they sort of tell you how much of culture influence they can move independently and controlling for size of the organization and market performance.
Yeah, let me just call out that first one that you emphasized, leaders consistently demonstrating organizational values, because I think that's part of the answer to Andres's question in the chat. He said, how can we make sure we live and breathe our company's values? He hears from his friends complaining that at their organizations, the values only exist in the walls, but people don't actually live them. And I think that top line here is a key driver of organizations that do that well.
One of the things we're hearing in a lot of our interviews is that organizations have recently or are in the process of revising their mission or purpose statements, and then taking those and determining, identifying what are the behaviors, what are, that actually exude those values, that actually support those, and then how can we hold leaders accountable for those actions and performance management processes. And I see here the second one, holding leaders accountable for employee outcomes. 29% impact, right? Influence on, I explained 29% of how participants rated their culture health. So it's a big part of sort of the model in how do you get incentivize and support leaders in demonstrating those behaviors.
Yeah, there's certainly some common themes here at the top of this chart. And again, these are issues that we continue to explore and try to bring out examples of companies that we think are doing a good job on this. It's very clear that employees are going to do what leaders do. They're not going to do what's in the PowerPoint or framed on the wall. And you can see towards the bottom, the talent mobility programs and the internal talent marketplace that we talked about before. Those are also things that we found through that analysis have a big influence on cultural health overall. Now, if you're thinking, okay, our culture needs to be revamped, and we've got to figure out how do we change it, we certainly want to direct you towards Culture Renovation. This was put together as a blueprint based on very successful organizations that have changed their culture, and that's a small minority of overall companies that have tried to change their culture. That lists out 18 leadership actions that companies can take, and these are sequential actions to really have impact on the overall culture. We term this culture renovation. If you're not familiar with it, renovation was a very specific term that we found really solidified what those successful organizations had done to their culture. They didn't transform their culture, which is the word most people use, or become something completely different. Instead, just like an old house, they carefully renovated what made them unique, what was hard to replace, and they renovated for future value. How do we improve the future value of the organization, just like you would an old house? And so this was a study based on, as you can see, a lot of respondents, and many of which had experience with culture change, but very few found it successful. And those 18 steps are divided using that renovation theme into 3 phases of plan, build, and maintain. So each one of these phases has 6 different steps that companies can take. And we'll make these slides available so you can see those steps if you're not familiar with them. You can also see those steps out on our website, culturerenovation.com. There's a lot more info that isn't necessarily in the book, such as additional case studies. There's a newsletter that's monthly, and you can see past editions of that newsletter or sign up for future editions, as well as some tools around how do we really have positive change to our culture and make it healthier going forward. So we want to make sure that you knew where to find those resources. Tom, while we have a few minutes left, anything else in the chat that you think would be useful for Catherine or I to address?
I think we've addressed most of the questions. I did respond to one from Lindsay. She had asked, did we tease out in this study any differences in companies that were largely remote or largely hybrid, at least prior to the pandemic? And Catherine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we specifically called that out as an independent variable or whatnot that we could look at differences. But I think we did in some previous studies, and certainly anecdotally in talking to companies, we've learned that like those like Dell, for example, I think had less turmoil, less change maybe during the pandemic because they had already had a hybrid and largely remote workforce. And I wanted to also highlight that at our conference, we're going to be having Wendy Barnes, the Chief People Officer from GitLab. They've been a firm somewhat smaller in size to some, but over 1,000 employees that's been fully remote for many, many years, since their inception. In fact, I think going back maybe 15 years. And so at our conference coming up in late March, we're going to learn from her some of the things that they went through and some of the best practices that they've learned from such a long history of working that way.
Yeah, great call out, Tom.
To Lindsay's point, I just posted a link in the chat to our flexibility or flight study that we did last year. In that, we did an analysis. We looked at companies that had drastically changed from on-site to remote today, and this was, of course, last year. And those countries are companies that had made a drastic shift, had positive outcomes. I believe that some of the workforce outcomes were there as well. I'd have to go back and look at the study, but there were positive consequences of having a more drastic shift, if you will. But we did those correlations with looking at the work model today. So we said basically if you're mostly remote today, and we looked at the correlations there, and there was a strong correlation to well-being and improved well-being. That was the workforce today, what their work arrangement looked like.
Great. Well, Catherine, I want to thank you for all that you've shared around culture fitness and all the work that you put into this study. There are a lot of others inside the organization that impacted this particular study, and too many to probably call out. But thank you very much for sharing with our audience today. Tom, as always, thank you for moderating this session. If you have more questions on this topic or some of the related topics that we addressed, here's our emails. So feel free to reach out to either myself or to Catherine or to Tom. We'd be happy to try to help you out. Tom, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Kevin. You both did a great job working with you at I4CP. I know how much goes into these kind of studies and piecing out all of the great data that we can share. So great job once again. And you're getting lots of thanks and kudos coming through in the chat. Just a reminder for everyone that this is a weekly series. So if you're fairly new to these events on Thursdays, please make sure you're registered and come join us again next Thursday. We'll have some outside guests from Experian joining us, and then folks from Providence Health and Toro in the subsequent weeks. Every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. Love to have you join us again in the future. So thanks everyone for the great conversation in the chat, and look forward to seeing you on some future calls.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.